There were heavy hints of great things ahead, but there would be no great breakthrough to the coast, and the battle they were choosing to call the Third Great Battle of Ypres would be known to the soldiers and to history by the name of an insignificant village less than 5 miles away. They called it Passchendaele, and it was to take the soldiers 99 days and 3 hours to get there.
When we started off, it was hard going because you were up to your knees in mud. But we didn't suffer any casualties until we got to Minty's farm. That's where one of the boys got hit with a shell. Sliced him in two, and then the upper part of his torso gesticulated, you see, and the kilt went on. One of my blokes wanted to run and pick up the upper part of the torso, chase the legs, join him up. That was the idea. But he was beyond anybody doing anything. We were plastered with shelling.
The troops advanced into a hail of German shells, but the real stumbling block was something which had been entirely unforeseen. The Germans had built a bulwark of strongholds and nobody knew they were there. The walls and the roofs were 3 feet thick, and with mud and sandbags stacked on top of them, they couldn't be seen from the air. Hidden in the shallow folds of the ridges surrounding the salient, they were invisible from the ground. After the news had been flashed back that the first German line had been captured, the infantry was shocked to discover they were storming a citadel.
They had pillboxes and machine gun posts all over the place. The dead and wounded were lying all about us, our boys and the Germans. I could see troops in front of me, crawling and jumping up and crawling again and dodging into shell holes. Away ahead, it was all smoke and explosions, and bullets flying out of Lewis guns like streams of fire all round these pillboxes they were attacking. There were boys with buckets of bombs, and one lad in particular I saw crawl up to the wall and reach up and chuck bombs in at the slit of the gun emplacement. They were all going at it, hammer and tongs. They were all going at it when it started to rain, and they were still going at it an hour after that. They were practically up to our knees in water.
The plan was to attack the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge from the sea on the 25th of August. This gave the troops 19 days to capture the Passchendaele Ridge and to advance 8 miles beyond it. But it was the start of the wettest August on record. The ground turned to porridge, and the army was stuck in the mud. So were the tanks. But before it began to rain, the tanks had done well. Leading the infantry, they had arrived at the slope below Glencorse Wood a few hours after the battle started. But the wood was now a bastion in the enemy's second line of defense. A line so formidable that it took 41 days of battering before its bloody stumps were finally captured, and the troops were able to cross it and push on to Polygon Wood a few hundred yards ahead. It was the 26th of September. In 2 months' fighting, the Tommies had managed to get halfway to the Passchendaele Ridge, and almost 90,000 of their comrades had been killed or wounded or captured on the way.
We were on a working party digging a cable trench when my chum, Ernie Gaze, got killed. Because as the troops got further on, they had to extend the communications. We were working at night in the dark, and there was shelling all the time, and machine gun fire. It was a machine gun bullet got Ernie. The worst job I had to do in the whole of the war was to bury my own pal. People at home, they had no idea what it was like. He didn't tell them. I wrote to Ernie's mother after he was killed, but just to tell her we'd buried him decently. He didn't tell people what it was like. They had no idea.
Dear friend, I am addressing you as friend, as any friend of my boys is my friend. I thank you for sending us word of how our dear Ernest died. We would not believe it till we had a letter from someone who saw him. Did you see my boy after he died? Could you tell us how he was? I'm sure we're all the while thinking of you dear lads, hoping and praying for you to be kept safe. And then when these awful tidings are sent to us, it shakes our faith. But then again, when we get calm, we know that God is still in his heaven, and he orders all things for the best. I sent Ernie a parcel off on 21st August. If you should see anything of it, will you share what is good between you and his friends? I shall never forget you, and hope you will write often to me. So, thanking you, I close. Yours truly, Mrs. Gaze.
There was now no possibility of breaking out of the salient before the high autumn tides and gales would make an attack on Ostend and Zeebrugge impossible. Before the end of September, the plan was finally cancelled, but the battle went on. General Gough, in command of the Fifth Army, begged Haig to call off the campaign, but the commander-in-chief refused. He was convinced by his intelligence reports that the Germans were almost at their last gasp. If victory could not be won by conquest, it would be achieved by attrition. 45,000 German soldiers lie in this single cemetery, still guarded as they were in battle by the pillboxes, the symbol of the sufferings of the Germans who defended them as they were of the Allies who attacked them.
Das war kein Leben mehr. Nur noch
It was no longer life at all. It was mere unspeakable suffering. And through this world of mud, the attackers dragged themselves slowly but steadily and in dense masses. Only too often, the masses were successful.
Behielt der Feind in seiner Vielzahl die Oberhand.
The troops fought and floundered with painful slowness through the rain and the mist, up the last of the ridges to Passchendaele. The British alone had lost 300,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. Some of the missing had been captured. Most had simply vanished into the mud. It was a heavy price to pay for a small village of which nothing now remained, but a stain of red brick where some cottage had stood, a cairn of white rubble that once was a church. The army stood on the ridge all through the freezing months of winter. In the spring, the next blow fell. Although it was more than a year since America had entered the war, no more than a token force of American soldiers had yet reached Europe. But by early summer, they would begin to arrive in significant numbers, and Germany wanted to get in first. In March and April of 1918, with the last of her strength, Germany struck out in a series of massive attacks. In the north, in Flanders, the army was forced to draw back. Passchendaele had to be given up, and the troops had no choice but to retrace their steps down the grisly, blood-soaked ridges it had cost so much to conquer. The Germans followed them. They stopped just here at Hellfire Corner on the very doorstep of Ypres. Here reads the memorial stone, "The invader was brought to a standstill." It was at least some cause for satisfaction that Ypres, or what remained of it, had not fallen to the enemy. It never did. 4 months later, when the tide had turned, the Allies began the push that would win the war and take them all the way to Germany. It is Armistice Day, the 11th of November. Ypres is uncannily shrouded in its familiar autumn mist. St. George's Church is packed with British visitors, and they are singing the Ypres hymn. Proudly you gathered, rank on rank to war, as you had heard God's message from afar. All you had hoped for, all you had you gave to save mankind. Yourselves you scorned to save. With the passage of 2 generations, the sentiments have become outmoded. But this was the Pilgrim's hymn. This is the Pilgrim's Church, built after the war as a focal point for the mourners who came to Ypres in tens of thousands to see for themselves the place where their husbands and fathers and sons had died. Essex Farm Cemetery. Like so many others on the old battlefields, it grew up around a tiny post where doctors patched up the wounded if they could, and when they could not, orderlies buried the dead. During the Second Battle of Ypres, the Canadian doctor John McCrae worked for 3 days and nights in these dugouts. When finally he blinked his way into daylight, the makeshift graveyard had blossomed into a blaze of poppies. Later that day, he scribbled these lines.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, saw dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields.
Armistice Day is still a public holiday in Belgium, a time for remembering, a time to honor the dead and to honor the living too.